There's a thing that happens in combat units when someone walks into a room and the air changes before anyone can explain why. I've seen it happen with generals. I've seen it happen with chaplains who've done 3 tours and carry it behind their eyes like a stone nobody's allowed to touch. I've seen it happen once in Kandahar when a K-9 handler walked into a forward operating base dragging a shepherd with a blood-soaked wrap on its foreleg, and every single rifle in the room tilted toward her without a word. You learn not to question it. Plus, the body knows things the brain is still catching up to. The Marines in Bay 4 that morning weren't the kind of men who questioned much. They'd been boots down pretty much in the Konar Valley for 11 weeks. They'd stopped flinching at the sound of rotors. They laughed too loud and slept with their hands balled into fists and called each other names. That would have gotten them court-martialed in polite company. They were look also to a man. The kind of unit that would size up any new face in under 4 seconds and assign it a ranking before the door closed. When she walked in, no announcement, no escort, carrying a kit bag that looked like it had been through 3 wars because it had. One of them leaned over to his buddy Gutierrez and said it loud enough that I heard it from across the, "Hey, who's that woman?" Gutierrez didn't answer, because the SEAL commander standing behind her had already stopped walking, had already come to something that wasn't quite parade rest and wasn't quite a salute and wasn't quite either, but was unmistakably, bone-clearly deference. This is what I wrote in my log at 0613 hours. Something just shifted. Don't know what yet. I was wrong about the yet part. I actually keep a log, which have since my second deployment. When a battalion surgeon told me that writing things down was how you kept the blur from becoming, I bought a green hardback journal at a PX in Bagram, and I've gone through 9 of them since. My quirk, Captain Heller calls it, which my nervous tick with a pen. He's not wrong. I wrote kind of the first entry about Staff Sergeant Marisol Vega at 0300 hours, 18 hours before she walked into Bay 4. I didn't know her name yet. I wrote unknown element inserted into QRF staging. No one's explaining her. That's how it started. The night before, the Konar Valley had been trying to kill Recon Team Ghost. That's not me being dramatic. That's the operational summary I filed later, with all the poetry wrung out. Enemy contact at 3 points. The kind of night where radio traffic comes back in fragments. A call sign, a grid, silence, another call sign. And you're sitting in the TOC with cold coffee going colder, moving markers on a map that's already an hour behind reality. I drink bad, to be fair, coffee on purpose now. Something about the bitterness keeps me present. I've tried to explain this to people, and they all look at me the same way. Like I've said something sad. Ghost Team had been tracking a weapons cache network operating through 3 villages north of the 10 days of surveillance. You know, good work. The kind, I think, of operation that's supposed to end with a controlled breach and zip ties and somebody shaking hands on a runway 48 hours later. It ended instead at 0140 with Ghost 3 calling a contact report and then going dead on comms, and Ghost Lead, a staff sergeant I hadn't yet met, calling back on a secondary frequency from a position that was, according to the grid she gave, behind enemy lines and wrong in 2 other ways I didn't understand yet. What I wrote at 0143, Ghost Lead has eyes on the missing element. Claims she can get him out. Command is discussing. What Command was actually doing was arguing. Captain Heller wanted to push the QRF, which Colonel Mast wanted to wait for daylight. 2 other staff officers I won't name were using words like protocol, and the kind of language that lives in offices and dies the moment you step outside them. I logged it all and said nothing, which is my other quirk. What I did not know, what none of us in the TOC knew, was that while we were having this conversation, Staff Sergeant Marisol Vega had already stopped waiting for us. The valley north of the cache site had a particular problem that didn't show up on any of our maps, because it wasn't a terrain feature. It was a behavioral one, which the cell operating through that corridor had a rotation pattern. Guards, watchers, listening posts that ran on a 40-minute cycle instead of the standard 60. Someone had trained them well, or they'd learned it themselves through attrition, which is the harder school. Ghost Team hadn't clocked it. They'd been running surveillance on a 60-minute assumption, and the overlap had burned them. Vega had clocked it on day 6. She hadn't briefed it up through formal channels because she'd been building the full picture. Cross-referencing movement against ambient sound patterns, she had a thing about sound, apparently. She'd grown up near a valley herself, somewhere in New Mexico, and understood the way ridgelines eat noise versus the way they throw it back. And she wasn't. On the night it mattered, she was certain. Ghost 3, Corporal Denny Alcott, had gone static in a dried creek bed approximately 340 meters northeast of the cache structure. Ankle, bad one. The kind that means you're not walking out, you're being carried, and carrying means noise. And noise in that corridor on that cycle means you've roughly 22 minutes between windows. Or you're handing the enemy something they can use on the news. Vega had 22 minutes and 340 meters and one other person with her, a junior analyst named Reyes, who she told, and this is from his statement, "Not mine. Stay on the radio. If I'm not back in 25, tell them I found the second cache." Reyes thought she was giving him cover. She'd actually found it on her way north, and she'd made a decision in the dark that I still think about when the coffee gets cold enough. She left the cache. She left the intelligence. She went to be fair for Alcott. I'm trying to write this the way it happened, which means I wasn't there. What I've is Alcott's statement, Reyes's statement, the secondary radio traffic, and what Vega wrote in her own after-action 4 sentences, which is either the most disciplined writing I've ever seen or the most deliberate redaction. What I can reconstruct, she found him in the creek bed. He was managing the pain the way trained soldiers manage pain, which is to say barely and with tremendous cost. She assessed, I think, the ankle, decided carrying was impossible given the terrain and the window, and made the second decision of the night. She didn't carry him, she built him something to walk on. The creek bed kind of had scatter, rocks, dead brush, a section of what turned out to be old irrigation tubing. The kind that's been bleaching in the Afghan sun for 15 years until it's brittle and gray, and she used her boot knife, the tubing, and the retention strap from her secondary kit to improvise a split that wasn't a splint. It was something between a brace and a threat. The kind of construction that says, this will hold for 20 minutes and not 1 second more. And you know it, and I know it, and we're doing it anyway. Alcott walked, which he walked 340 meters on a broken ankle in 21 minutes through a corridor where men with rifles were rotating on a cycle Vega had in her head like a metronome. Sort of, she didn't carry him. She walked beside him. To be fair, she set the pace. When he slowed, pretty much, she didn't reach for him. She leaned into his peripheral vision and moved, which made him move. Which is either cruelty or the most precise understanding of human pain response I've encountered. I asked Alcott about it later in the medical tent, while a PA was rewrapping what the field brace had done to his ankle. He honestly said, "She never touched me after she put the brace on. Like she knew if she touched me, I'd stop." He looked at the ceiling for a second. She was right. They came out of the corridor at 0248 on the second window. Reyes had the radio. Command had finally stopped arguing and the QRF was spinning up, which meant they arrived at the exfil point approximately 9 minutes after Vega and Alcott were. I wrote at 0251, Ghost Lead and Ghost 3 at exfil. Like Ghost Lead status unknown. Ghost 3 ambulatory somehow. How? The how took me until 600 to piece together. By then, Vega was in the staging bay, drinking water from a bottle she'd been working on since the helo landed, and the SEAL commander attached to the Joint Task Force, a man named Greer, whose default expression is a wall and whose salutes are famous in 3 branches for being precisely 1 degree, warmer than regulation, was standing in the doorway watching her. I was watching Greer watch her, and he had that look. The one I've seen on men who've spent enough time in hard places that they've developed a very specific radar for people who've done the same, like identifying a caliber from the sound of a shot. He hadn't spoken yet. The thing about the cache, the one she'd passed on her way to Alcott, the one she'd left in the dark and filed away, is that she'd marked the grid in her head, just memorized coordinates she carried back out of the valley in her skull alongside everything. She briefed it at 05:45 to a half-awake intelligence officer who'd been expecting a standard exfil. TBH, 4 sentences in his and T's. The last one reads, grid confirmed via ISR post brief. Cache located exactly as reported and estimated material value. Significant. Significant. The military word for things that change the shape of the next 6 months. She'd been in the valley for 11 days. She'd walked out with a broken ankle man and a cache location and 4 sentences in her. After action that don't mention herself once. The whole document is written in passive voice. You know, contact was assessed. No, which in my opinion, I pointed this out to Captain Heller when I showed him the report. He read it, which read it again. She wrote it honestly, that way on purpose, he said. He handed it back without answering. Which is the thing he does when the answer is obvious and he doesn't want to embarrass me by. I thought about it for a while. I'm still thinking about it. Plus, my best theory, written in my journal at 6:18, goes like this. Some people perform their competence for the room. Some kind of people perform it for the record. She performed, it for no one. Which means the only audience was the outcome. Which means she's the most dangerous kind of. I crossed that out and rewrote it. Still didn't get it right. At 06:13, Lance Corporal DeVries said, "Who's that woman?" At 06:13 and 30 seconds. Commander Greer stopped walking. The salute, if you want to, call it that, came later, after the debrief. After the intelligence officer had stopped looking stunned, after Alcott had been loaded onto the medevac with his rebuilt ankle and his statement about Vega's hands and his ceiling-staring silence. What I basically wrote in my log when I saw it, Greer saluted first. Regulation form look, but something else underneath it. She took it like it was expected, which means it wasn't unexpected. Which means she's done this before. Which means I've been operating with incomplete information for 11 days. DeVries was still watching from across the bay. I could see him doing the math. The slow recalculation that happens when someone's category gets. He didn't say anything else. Plus, but I turned to a new page. 3 days after I think the Konar exfil, the cache site blew up. 4:17 in the morning. A detonation that showed up on seismic monitoring 40 kilometers south and rattled the tin roof of the TOC hard enough that I grabbed my journal off the table before I grabbed my radio, which tells you something about my priorities under stress that I'd rather not examine. I wrote, cache detonated. Either we hit it or they burned it. If they burned it, they knew we knew. Then I set the pen down and thought about what that meant. Then I picked it back up. If they knew we knew, someone in the corridor saw her come out. Funny enough, Vega was in the TOC when the seismic report came in. She'd been there for 40 minutes already, working at a field table in the corner with a topographic overlay and a set of acetate markers, doing the kind of pre-dawn map work that separates people who are processing the last operation from people who are already building the next one. She didn't look up when the detonation report hit the board. I watched her not look up. She'd already run the math. Captain Heller pulled the duty officer aside. I slid closer to Vega's table, not close enough to be obvious, close enough to see what she was marking. She'd drawn a secondary movement corridor, north of the cache, parallel to the route Ghost Team had used. 3 observation points circled in red, each one at intervals that matched the 40-minute rotation she'd identified on day 6. One of pretty much the circles had a small annotation next to it. 2 words in her compressed, slightly right-leaning print. Already watching, in my opinion, and I looked at her. She looked at the map. They were watching, the whole time, I said. Sort of, not a question. Part of it, she said. Which part? She basically tapped the northernmost circle. Maybe day 7. That was 4 days before the exfil. 4 days during which Ghost Team had continued to operate under the assumption that they're, you knew? Suspected. Basically, she recapped the marker. There's a difference. I wrote that down that night. Not in the log. In the margin of the log in smaller letters, like a footnote I wasn't sure belonged in the official record. She suspected for 4 days and stayed in the corridor anyway. Here's the thing I couldn't get out of my head. She'd had a window to report the compromise. Which the kind of situation where the correct procedure, the textbook procedure, the career-protecting procedure, is to improve immediately, trigger a tactical pause, Let command run a fresh assessment. She hadn't done that. She'd stayed. Kept building the picture. She'd been positioned to respond because she'd never left. Commander Greer, when I finally got 20 minutes with him, said this. There's a specific kind of soldier who treats the protocol as the ceiling. They want to know what's in the room, and they operate to the edge of the rules, and then they... Stop! He was looking at the valley through a reinforced window, hands clasped behind his back. I noticed his posture was exactly the same as it had been in the doorway of Bay 4. That particular quality of stillness that's at rest, it's coil. And then there's the other kind. I asked what the other kind did. Treats the protocol as the floor, he said. He didn't say which kind Vega was. He didn't need to. The intelligence debrief on day 14 was when it fell apart. There were, I think, 8 people at the table, a 2-star who'd flown in from Bagram, 3 staff officers from the Joint Task Force whose names I never learned because they'd all been replaced by the time I filed my final report. Contractor named Paulson who wore fleece indoors and spoke about threat networks the way some people speak about the stock market, technically precise and personally disconnected from the human cost of being wrong, I guess. And Vega, she sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes, which was fine because the 2-star was working through a prepared brief. That covered in considerable detail the operational significance of the cache site, the intelligence value of its destruction, and the tactical implications for the network's logistics chain. It was a honestly good brief. Plus the kind of work that happens when smart people have 48 hours and access to ISR and satellite data and the work of the people who'd been on the ground. At minute 42, Vega said, Sir, there's a 3rd node. The 2-star stopped. She didn't, honestly, wait for him to respond. She pulled out her own overlay, the one with the acetate and the circled observation points, and she placed it on the table and she said in the flattest, most conference room voice I'd ever heard on someone who'd been in a combat corridor 6 days earlier. The cache we hit was distribution, not storage. Storage is here. She tapped a ridge 2 kilometers north of everything we'd been working. They moved the primary material before we got the cache grid. Probably within 6 hours of Corporal Alcott's compromise. Silence, Paulson said. That's not consistent with our pattern analysis. Vega looked at him. Your pattern-like analysis used 60-minute rotation intervals. He opened his mouth. She put 2 fingers on the overlay. I documented it on day 6. It's in my, to be fair, field notes, which are in the intelligence packet, which, and here she paused just briefly, just long enough to be precise rather than cutting. I can pull up if that's helpful. The 2-star looked at Greer. Greer looked at, actually, the overlay. Pull it up, the 2-star said. The field notes were 11 pages, in my opinion, dense. The kind of documentation that looks at first glance like the work of someone who's anxious or compulsive because of the volume and the granularity. Sound observations, shadow angle notations, behavioral anomalies logged by time. Grid with a specificity that read less like a military report and more like something a scientist would write about a system they were trying to understand from the inside. Paulson read 2 pages and set it down. I read all 11, twice. Plus, I took 4 pages of notes. The actually rotation analysis alone was worth the full read. She'd built it from ambient sound patterns, the specific way voices carry in the valley's upper, the acoustic signature of a guard who clears his throat at the end of a watch versus beginning, boot sounds on loose shale at distances the eye can't resolve in the dark. She'd been using the valley's own acoustics as a secondary surveillance tool for 8 days, while we'd been relying on equipment that cost more than most forward operating bases. I wrote that night, after the debrief had ended and the 2-star's helo had lifted and the talk had gone back to its ambient hum. She built the intelligence picture out of things the technology can't hear. I don't know what to do with that information. I think I'm supposed to put it in a report. I, in my opinion, think the report won't contain it. The secondary storage site was confirmed by ISR 16 hours, right where she'd put the finger, and not approximately. Heller brought me the confirmation imagery and set it on my desk without comment, which was his version of a very loud statement.